Frankly, no other author has, for me, ever done this as well, and that includes writers far more appreciated for their literary skills. Burroughs was also a better stylist than Kline. Kline could be wooden at times, which is not to say Burroughs didn't have his Pinocchio moments, but in his earlier books, these moments are less frequent. He wasn't a fancy or consistent stylist, but Burroughs, when on, had a kind of oddly combined American, Western, Victorian style that had the energy and forward thrust of a rapier. Burroughs wrote his early work from the heart, though in later books it's obvious that he wrote primarily from the pocketbook. But if Burroughs was the best at this type of interplanetary romantic adventure, Kline was the second best. His tales take a bit more of a running start than Burroughs, and where Burroughs' books have a metaphysical feel, a borderline supernatural ambience, even when using pseudoscience, Kline depended on scientific explanation for his adventures, or at least all of the ones I've read. Sure, the science was no more realistic than that of many writers of the day, no more realistic than that proposed by Burroughs, but it seemed important to Kline to convince the reader that there was a real and logical reason that these events could occur. Burroughs, even when being scientific, had little to no patience for explanation or for technology. His method of attack was to use it as an imitating circumstance and then get on with the story. Perhaps I'm wrong, and Kline felt the same way, but I sense in his books a greater concern for the pseudo-scientific. Maybe it was the way Kline convinced himself the story was real, and simultaneously invited those readers in who needed this approach to persuade them of the story's verisimilitude. That said, both Burroughs and Kline had the ability to invite you into their universes and to carry you away to adventure, if on slightly different but very similar rail lines. Certainly these trains ran side by side, and at some point crossed in close proximity, and in near and colorful collision, but they were their own rail lines. They wrote to entertain and to get paid, of course, but it seems obvious to me that Kline, like Burroughs, began writing to let the dreams out of his head. These dreams, like Athena erupting from the head of Zeus, jumped forth full-born from his brow. Before continuing with this, I'm going to pause for a kind of intermission. I want to note that Kline was not only a writer, he was an agent, and eventually he abandoned writing to launch the careers of others. Perhaps he let it all out of his head, these colorful, blood-drenched dreams, woke up one morning with the creative part of his skull satisfied, or maybe the rootin'-tootin' daydreams of others were satisfying enough. Whatever the case, Kline embraced being an agent and gave up on writing. Robert E. Howard was Kline's most famous client, and there's some speculation, though no proof, that Kline wrote the ending to the then-deceased Howard's interplanetary romance, Elmuric, which is very much a later rival to Burroughs's tales in its inventiveness and spirit of storytelling. In fact, I think it's amongst the best of its kind, and though it's possible Kline gave an ending to this unfinished project, as it was certainly in a vein of storytelling he understood, there's nothing to indicate a similarity in style. Though Elmuric was in Kline's wheelhouse, OAK had a particular way of writing and forming sentences, and there isn't anything in his writing that I've read that suggests a flexibility of style, the ability to be a mock turtle, which for me leaves this possibility of a collaboration out in the cold without a coat. But enough about that. Enough about Kline's time as an agent. Let us return to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when Kline was a writer. The Outlaws of Mars was written in the 30s and appeared in Argosy Weekly. It is very much in the Burroughs interplanetary format. A young American, Jerry Morgan, already skilled in the ways of combat, due to his time in the Army, goes to the home of his uncle, Dr. Morgan, and is, after a little too much explanation about telepathy and machinery, transported via machine to Mars. The reason for Jerry's departure is embarrassment of a sort having to do with the woman. Though the event is never fully explained, it appears Jerry has allowed a lie about himself to exist, to keep from compromising the aforementioned young lady. So our noble, romantic, and very Victorian hero flees our world for one of adventure on Mars. Upon his arrival, there is enough action for 3 novels, some court intrigue, treachery, weird inhabitants, sword-fighting, and one hot mama named Junia. Frankly, the plot is of little consequence, and is not dissimilar from those of the Burroughs novels or of any sword and planet adventure written by Kline himself. Movement is the name of the game, and Kline provides that in proverbial spades. There's hardly a moment to breathe, and the only time the novel bogs down is when Kline tries to justify his plot with too much explanation. When Kline is moving the story forward, bringing on the action, keeping us tightly wrapped up in his warm and bloody dream,